Chapter 2. The Execution. The tailor and the shoemaker go along together, the tailor happy and the shoemaker lonely and envious, with the result that when they go through the woods the tragedy begins and the shoemaker wreaks his revenge on the tailor. The shoemaker has his serpentine, introverted qualities, like Prometheus. He looks ahead and takes more bread with him than the tailor, who, as the Epithean man, learns only by the experience. That is the difference between introvert and extrovert. The introvert worries through life, always looking ahead with the danger of becoming pessimistic, and the extrovert jumps first into every situation and looks afterward, when he discovers that he has fallen into a hole whence he struggles out, saying that he never saw it. Naturally, both attitudes, if they become too one-sided, are destructive. Here the two get lost in the woods and are hungry, and the shoemaker has the bread, which he sells to the tailor as at the price of his eyes. That is, he tries to destroy the tailor's health in connection with life, of which he is jealous. You might say that the counter tendency of the unconscious, the melancholic, suspicious, introverted attitude, blinds the other side and takes away his capacity to see things. As an example, the successful businessman with a strong extroverted drive slowly acquires the suspicious nature brought on through the neglect of his introverted side. If he does not turn to the shadow figure and endeavor to see where his moods originate, he will be blinded and make one mistake after another, for the shadow will force him to change his attitude, if not voluntarily, then involuntarily. He will have failures in his business, or he will fall ill and so be forced to develop the other side. I remember a very extroverted lawyer who had been successful with his extroverted attitude, but he began to have fits of unhappiness and negative moods. When talking to him once, I said that it might be a good idea to go for a holiday alone and look at the other side. But he turned the suggestion down, saying that if he was alone he got melancholic and overwhelmed with depression. Then he had a bad accident. He broke his hip and was in the hospital for 8 months, so that he had his lonely holidays inescapably forced on him. The other side imposed itself upon him. This would be the mechanism which plays between the opposites, as with the shoemaker and the tailor, and which ends in the former leaving the tailor blind under the gallows. The gallows with the two poor devils hanged on them form an interesting motif which we should follow up. The habit of killing bad criminals by hanging them on trees is a very archaic one. It was originally practiced as a sacrifice. Germans in olden days, for instance, hanged prisoners as sacrifices to the god Wotan. They hanged not only criminals but also enemies captured in battle. The victor would say to his prisoner, quote, "Now I will dedicate you to Wotan." Close quote. Wotan himself is the god who hangs on the tree, for he hung on the oak Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, and then found the ruins and acquired secret wisdom. It is an old Germanic idea that suspension on a tree is a sacrifice to that god. In Christianity, you might see this archetypal idea in the form of the crucifixion of Christ, and in the area of Asia Minor, Attis was suspended on the fir tree. He was killed and his picture was hung on a fir tree, and in the spring festivals the image of the suspended Attis was carried about. We have to ask what lies behind the idea of killing an enemy not as social revenge or in judgment, but by the more archaic form of a sacrifice to the gods. I think that there is a much deeper and more meaningful idea than that of just punishment. If one has to fight against demonic evil in a human being, what strikes one most is that if people are outstandingly destructive, not just through the small mistakes of laziness and cheating, etc., which take place with every human being, but if they are seriously destructive, one's immediate reaction is that it is inhuman, especially in psychosis or psychotic states, where one sometimes meets destructiveness so cold and inhuman and demonic and concomitantly so divine that one is overwhelmed. It sends a grim, cold shiver down one's spine that one cannot deal with. It is too horrible, too shocking. And this shocking, horrible thing in people enables them to commit cold blooded murder. I have never dealt with anybody who committed an actual murder, but I have met people who could have, and that makes one shudder, and one thinks, quote, hands off, close quote. Yet, at the same time, one has the feeling that it is something godlike, no longer human. We use the word inhuman, but one could equally well say demonic or divine. The primitive idea that somebody who commits a murder or an outstanding crime is really not himself but performs something which only a god could do express the situation very well. In the moment when people so when in the moment when someone commits a murder, he is identical with the Godhead and is not human. People become the instruments of God's darkness. At such a time, they are possessed. The very fact that somebody imagines that he can kill a fellow being, someone of the same substance as himself, which is not normal, transcends human nature, and in that way the deed has a demonic or divine quality. That is why, for instance, in the ritual executions in primitive tribes, you see that though they kill the criminals, there is no element of moral judgment about it. The criminal simply bears the consequence of his deeds.
The primitive says that if a human being acts as though divine, then he suffers the fate of a god, is treated as a god and hanged, killed or dismembered, and so on. One cannot be a human society and behave like a divine being who can kill ad libitum. I read a paper about the execution of a member of a North American Indian tribe. A medicine man made the mistake of asking too high fees of people and made such an abuse of this habit that he became inhuman. From a widow he took everything and left ruined. He went beyond human limits. These acts aroused suspicion in the tribe, but it did not mature for a long time. Instead, the suspicion went beneath the surface. The medicine man continued in his way and, feeling the criticism in his surroundings, became more and more demanding, probably to compensate the uncertainty in himself. He claimed to be the best medicine man, etc., until the whisperings in the tribe that he must be possessed by an evil spirit became louder and louder. One day the elders of the tribe told him that the tribe believed him to be possessed by evil. As the medicine man did not deny it, they took him into the desert for a trial by ordeal and find out if it was true. They made sand paintings and drawings, and all the medicine men invoked the spirits, saying that the medicine man was possessed by evil demons, and they wished to save him. The accused medicine man prayed with the others. Since no answer came, he was executed, quartered by 4 horses. He agreed with the sentence himself. To him it was not a question of being morally condemned, but simply of having fallen inextricably for the gods of evil, of losing his humanness. He was absolutely at peace with his execution. This is the natural behavior toward the evil forces in man, which seems impressive and close to the psychological truth of these things. This closeness probably reveals why criminals in the past were often executed in a way by which they were identified with a god. One recognized they had fallen into the hands of the dark godhead, and therefore had to suffer their bitter fate. The symbolism of the suspended god on the tree, the gallows, and the cross is very profound. Such a fate normally overtakes the part of the divinity most interested in man. The philanthropic part of the godhead falls into the tragedy of suspension and has to do with the bringing of civilization, as in the Wotan myth, where after suspension on the tree, Wotan discovers the ruins, an implication of a progress in human consciousness. We have first to go into the symbolism of the tree. In the philosophical tree, in alchemical studies, Jung shows that the tree symbolizes human life and development with the inner process of becoming conscious. One could say that it symbolizes in the psyche that something which grows and develops undisturbed within us, irrespective of what the ego does. It is the urge toward individuation which unfolds and continues, independent of our consciousness. In European countries, when a child is born, a tree is planted at the same time and will die when the human dies. This expresses the idea that the tree provides an analogy to human life, that the tree carries life, like the lights on the Christmas tree, and that the sun rising at the top of the tree implies growth toward higher consciousness. There are many mythological stories which liken the tree to the human being, or in which the tree appears as a man-tree. The self is the tree, that which is greater than the ego in man. Part of our life passes like a drama written by a novelist biographer, but behind that there is a mysterious process of growth which follows its own laws and takes place behind the biographical peripeteias of life and goes from childhood to old age. Viewed in a mythological context, the greater human being, the anthropos, is likened to a tree. The motif of the human-shaped Godhead being suspended on a tree mirrors the tragedy of a human existence. The conscious man constantly pulls away, trying to free himself and to act freely and consciously, and he is then painfully pulled back to the inner process. The struggle reveals a tragic constellation if it is represented in this painful form. That is why the whole philosophy of the Christian religion has a tragic view of life. To follow Christ, we have to accept mortification and repress certain impulses toward growth. The basic idea is that human life is based on conflict and strives towards spiritualization, which does not come of itself but is brought forth with suffering. The same idea is represented in a more archaic form in the Wotan myth, Wotan hanging on the tree. He is the eternal wanderer who roams all over the earth, the god of impulsiveness, of rage, of poetic inspiration, that element in the human being which lives in constant restlessness, bursting out into affects. And if this god was suspended on the tree for 9 days and 9 nights, he consequently discovered the ruins of writing by which civilization based on the written word was founded. Whenever the conscious and animal personality is in conflict with the inner process of growth, it suffers crucifixion. It suffers crucifixion. It is in the situation of the god suspended on the tree and is involuntarily nailed to an unconscious development from which it would like to break away but cannot. We are nailed down to something greater than ourselves which does not allow us to move and which outreaches us. The Attis myth, which is older than the myth of the crucified God in Christianity, represents this in specific form. Attis, the beloved son of the Great Mother, and himself the type of divine youth that does not grow old and decay, represents the pattern of pure Eternus, the perennial young God, eternally beautiful, the figure that which cannot suffer sadness, human restriction, disease, ugliness, and death. Like this God, most young men who have a decided mother complex feel a somewhat moment in their lives that the process of life does not allow for such a state of being eternal. It has to die. In the plenitude of life, life lies ahead with its meaningfulness and splendor, but we know that this never lasts. It is always destroyed by the dark side of life. Therefore, this young God always dies early, nailed to the tree, which is again the mother. The maternal principle which gave birth to him swallows him back in the negative form, and he is reached by ugliness and death. You see this sometimes in the case of a young man who should marry or choose a profession, or who discovers that fullness of youth is leaving him and that he has to accept the ordinary human fate. Many at that moment prefer to die either by an accident or in war, rather than become old. At the critical time between 30 and 40, the tree is growing against them. Their inner development is no longer in tune with the conscious attitude, but grows against it, and in that moment they have to suffer a kind of death. It should mean a change of attitude, but may mean actual physical death, a kind of disguised suicide, because the ego cannot give up its attitude. That is the crucial moment where they are sacrificed by a process of inner development, which is turned against them. When the inner growth is the enemy of consciousness, this means that something within the man wants to outgrow him that he cannot follow, and he therefore has to die. For the self-will of the conscious personality has to die, and surrender to the process of inner growth. Another aspect of hanging as a means of killing someone is that in most mythological systems, the air is the place in which ghosts and spirits roam about, like Wutan and his army of ghosts of the dead that fly through the air, especially on stormy nights. Therefore, if you hang someone, you turn him into a ghost, and he must now ride with the other dead, with Wutan in the air. In the cult of Dionysus, gifts were put on swings on the tree with the idea that Dionysus was a spirit and would see them. The gifts could thus be lifted into the air and given to the spiritual beings who live there. An expression illustrates this situation from a certain angle. We speak of suspension. When an inner psychological conflict gets too bad, life gets suspended. The two opposites are equal. The yes and no are equally strong, and life cannot go on. You wish to move with the right leg and the left refuses, and vice versa. And you have the situation of suspension which leads a complete stoppage in the flow of life and intolerable suffering. Being stuck in conflict, nothing happening, is the most painful form of suffering. When the shoemaker has blinded the tailor where the two criminals are hung, we might say that that symbolizes a suspension of conflict where the process of life has stopped. The opposites have clashed and life became stuck. The two dead people on the gallows mirror the shoemaker and tailor now in a state of sterile suspension. Naturally, as we have referred the whole story in the situation of the collective Christian era, we have to ask who these two are. If it were one suspended man, the idea would be close at hand as a hidden form of the symbol of Christ, the basic symbol of the Christian religion, the God hanging on the cross. But there are two sinners, and therefore we have to ask who the second could be. There are several, especially German, fairy tales which represent the evil spirit nailed to a tree or a wall. Or the two people might in the same way allude to Christ suspended on the cross and Wutan on the tree, the good God suspended on the cross and the other God on the tree. This is not too far-fetched, because the motif of the two divine beings nailed to the tree or the cross occurs in many Christian legends, and in the legends of the Arthurian circles and the circle of the Holy Grail, where Parsifal has to find not only the Grail containing Christ's blood, but also the stag, or stag's head, nailed to an oak tree, from which he has to take it down. In the main legend he does not forget, and he finds the Grail before finding the stag's head, and brings it to a divine female figure. Or the stag is represented as an evildoer, a destroyer of the woods in Christ's shadow. The stag with its beautiful antlers and an unnecessary decoration which hampers its movement and whose object is to impress the female deer suggests the idea of an arrogant creature and therefore represents the shadow of the Christian principle, an incredible arrogance and superciliousness which we have acquired and which seems one of the worst shadow attitudes spread with the Christian teaching. A concrete illustration of what this arrogant shadow means after crops up in analysis. Under the cloak of being Christian and kind to our fellow men, we do not speak of our resistances, but instead produce a lot of negative assertions and judgments with a sweet Christian attitude, until a dream shows that has happened. The analysand has not spoken of resistances because they might lead to difficulties, and anyway, the analyst has already been forgiven. That is arrogance. It would be much simpler to say, I blame you for this and that. What have you to say about it? That would be being human, modest, and normally related. But instead, negative reactions under the cloak of forgiveness and a virtuous and superior attitude and the knowledge that the analyst is a human being has negative sides. That is the poison of a wrong Christian attitude. I have often met with this and resent this forgiveness and sweetness of people and would prefer that they were more naturally related and would say straight out what they thought so that one could get to a human understanding. The shadow of the Christian attitude is symbolized by the stag hung up in the tree in the medieval legends. If someone just pardons a fellow human being, then nothing happens. The negative assumptions remain for the next 10 years. Such people will keep their negative judgments of the analyst for 3 or 4 years of analysis and have neither the courage nor decency to discuss the matter, for they are sure the other could not take it, and that it would be unchristian to bring it up. The negative assumption then gets stuck and the positive attitude of politeness and forgiveness remains. If an analysis gets stuck, you may be sure that something like this has happened. You cannot always catch it, but it is there, and neither the good nor the evil side can evolve. Through an open dialogue, relationship could reestablish itself and the whole thing would flow again. That is a place where one generally has to interfere and perhaps suggest that an analysan go to a colleague, and generally then there is a big outburst that gives material on which to proceed. Usually there is a false attitude in the conscious personality and the idea that this is something with which I can deal myself, and so the person's own inner development is hindered through narrowness and prejudice. While the tailor sits under the gallows, on the head of each of the men hanging above him alights a crow, and the two begin to talk. The first crow says that the dew which this night has fallen over them from the gallows will restore the eyesight of anyone who washed in it. If the blind knew that, many who do not think it possible could have their sight restored. Here is a general and archetypal representation found in many civilizations and religious creeds. The remains of an executed criminal are potent medicine. It confirms the idea that execution is a deification, that the criminal had the arrogance to assume the role of the gods and so is given back to them. And what was negative in the living human becomes positive in the beyond. What was destructive in the human state is again constructive when back in its proper place. The right balance between the divine and the human is reestablished, and that through a potent medicine is produced. So the rope on which the human being was hung was used for healing purposes. Quote, take a piece of the rope on which a man has been hung, or nail parings, etc., and you will find a potent medicine. Close quote. The healing power in the relics of the saints has the same idea. The fact that executed criminals are treated like saints shows what the common idea is. The crows, which in Germanic mythology belong to Wotan and in the Mediterranean to Apollo, represent the capacity for divination. Apollo is the owner of the Delphic oracle and the revealer of truth, and the same applies to Wotan. Blackbirds, ravens, and crows are believed capable of knowing the future, of telling the hidden truth. In part, this evolved since ravens and crows often assemble in places where a battle takes place, or on a house where someone is dying. When many crows or ravens frequently assemble in a place, people say that someone will die, and the crows know it. From that hook came the projection that they knew the truth and the future. Wotan had two ravens, Hugin and Munin, his sources of secret information. Birds in general represent intuitive hunches, creatures which fly in the air in the meaning of the spiritual world, and have therefore to do with the involuntary thoughts which are revealed to be true. These two birds are the spirits of truthfulness. In the end, the shoemaker finishes up under the gallows, and the crows pick out his eyes. The birds represent the invisible truth of the unconscious which fulfills itself. The shoemaker does not come to his end by human power, but by unconscious truth. If we observe unconscious processes, we see that wrong deeds do not have to be avenged by other human beings, for they are punished from within. The murderer ultimately kills himself. This is a terrible truth again and again confirmed. Frequently one is shocked by the injustice of human life, when the evil man prospers and the good man does not. But psychologically, this is not true, and it sometimes makes one shudder to realize what people risk. They may succeed in the outer world, but they incur terrible psychological punishment. Young once told of a woman who had committed murder. She put poison in the soup of another woman who was in love with her lover, and she was not found out. She came to confession absolutely destroyed. She felt cut off, for people had begun to avoid her without knowing why. She lost all her maids and servants, and nobody wanted to live near her. She lived quite alone. She rode every day, but then the horse would bolt and would not carry her. And then one morning she called her dog, and the dog put its tail between its legs and slunk away. She was slowly and cruelly ruined from within. This secret truth, law of inner truth, is here expressed by the crows who are the spirits of truth, and also have to do with healing power. In the tale of Apollo and Coronis, from whose union resulted the birth of Asclepios, the crow too gave valuable information. It is the crows who call the tailor's attention to cure for his eyes. Dew, in general, carries the projection of manifesting an act of divine grace. In the Bible, we have the story of Gideon's fleece on which the dew falls, an act by God which showed his grace. This is also interpreted as a prefiguration of the Holy Ghost descending on the Virgin Mary. In North American civilization, dew and rain are the great blessings on which depend the fertility of the earth. One must perhaps have lived in such a country to know the feeling of dew or rain that is experienced as divine grace. For by it everything comes to life. Now that these sinners have paid for their sins, the grace of God falls on them again. In the beyond there is a reconciliation of the opposites, and therefore the dew has healing power. Psychologically, dew represents the first beginning of objective psychological insight during such a state of suspension. Let us return to the conflict as it reaches its climax. There is the state of suspension where everything is stuck. The ego is in the state of yes and no, and there is the torture of arrested life and sterility. In such a moment the ego surrenders, admitting that this is an insoluble conflict, one that it cannot solve, and will submit to something objective, to a sign of God which will become evident. We say we will come to what the dreams say. Neither analyst nor analysand can say anything further, but does the objective psyche produce any kind of material or signs which lead further? Only the dreams and fantasies are left, and they represent the dew, an objective living manifestation which comes from the depth of the psyche and can be studied and which restores eyesight. If you can then understand the secret hints which are contained in a dream, your eyes are opened and you discover life and find it on a new level. Only the guidance of the unconscious can help at such a moment and provide the healing dew which falls upon us. That is why the tailor uses the dew and is able to go on again with his eyes cured and, thanking God, goes to the king's city in alchemy. The divine water is also called the healing remedy for blindness. Afterward come the 4 tests where the tailor spares the horse by not riding him, the stork and the ducks by not eating them, and the bees by not taking away their nest. He then becomes the tailor at the king's court, where the shoemaker slanders him so that he is forced to find the golden crown, which the ducks bring up from the bottom of the lake to make a well, from which the horse stamps out of the ground to build a copy of the royal castle, which the bees make from their wax, and then the stork brings a boy to the king who has only daughters. 4 tasks, the typical number of totality. If you know many fairy tales, you will know that it is not normal, for normally there are only 3 tasks, but then there is always a 4th thing which happens, an event and not a task. Here there are 4 tasks and no further event. The further event would be that the tailor becomes king. The horse stamps out the water for the well. The horse symbolizes a kind of domesticated vital libido which can bring forth the well of the unconscious. Only if we invest our whole devotion to the instinctive unconscious does it begin to produce its water of life. There are people who have the task of writing on a theme but say it is dull and does not appeal to them. But after investing some libido in it, they discover an inner flow of creativity. Many lazy people wait for inspiration until they are 80 and none comes. However, there are situations where one cannot wait. One has to make the first move and invest one's own vital strength in the task before it reveals its meaning. The second task is to bring up the king's crown from the water. 2 ducks fulfill it. In antique Greece, the duck belonged to the love goddess, and in circumpolar shamanism, it is a shaman's guide to the beyond and back. It can move on earth, in water, and in air, which is why it is the guide to the unconscious. The crown of the king symbols its function of representing the ultimate totality, which could hold the opposites together. The 2 ducks already symbolize a cooperation of the opposites. Good and evil are opposed to each other in the shoemaker and the tailor, but the tailor wins out because he respects the powers which work toward a union of opposites. The motif of the model castle is a strange one. The castle in itself is a maternal feminine symbol. It encompasses and protects the royal family. It often has the shape of a mandala and therefore has to do with bringing the idea of totality into earthly reality, which is a task of the feminine principle. In our story, it is done by the model, which is built by the bees. Bees have always appealed to the human mind because of their organized behavior, as evidenced also by other insects. Bees have an incredible unconscious cooperation of the whole group, though we think of them as completely unconscious and as having only a sympathetic nervous system. The late Carl von der Frisch described most astonishing experiments made with bees. They can distinguish colors and can show each other where nectar is. A bee will fly in a big circle and find honey, but does not have to fly back the same way. It can go straight, and by certain movements of the back and wings can show and tell the others so they can go straight to the honey. It has been discovered that their system of orientation has to do with the polarization of sunlight. The unconscious instinct of the bees is amazing, and they therefore often symbolize harmonious functioning without rational organization. Our communal life is more complicated than that of the bees, but we have also an instinctual basis for it. Our instinctual basis was and still is the performing of instinctual rituals which hark back to the most archaic times. With the development of consciousness, however, these archaic rituals have been amplified and even sometimes superseded by rational organization. Instinctual oneness with one's task and surroundings is an ideal state, the state where the religious archetype simply holds people together and they cooperate on a natural basis. This is a functioning which man has always lost and sought again. You find it in all youthful communities. In Zen Buddhism, there were such groups gripped by the same living symbol. They were strong social bodies which functioned without too many outer regulations. The mystery cults in late antiquity are an example of our civilization. We know a little of initiation of Apuleius and into the Isis mysteries. He was to have initiated into a higher degree, but did not have the money. Then Osiris told him in a dream to go to the priest and ask to be initiated, and the priest had also had a dream telling him to reduce the fees. The god therefore organized the group, and both the priest and the organization submitted to archetypal instigation. As long as a community functions in that way, there is real freedom of the human being and cultural life in a group. So we can say that the building of the castle by the bees is a model of the rebuilding instigation into the state. Then the stork, the most pious bird, as an old Jewish tradition says, brings the new child. In his book, Alchemical Studies, Young quotes a lot about the stork. He discusses the alchemical picture of the tree of life, on a high branch of which is the stork. The mysterious mythological meaning of the stork in Jewish tradition goes back to Jeremiah 8:7. Quote, Ye, the stork in heaven knoweth her appointed times, and the turtle and the crane and the swallow observe the time of their coming. But my people know not the judgment of the Lord. Close quote. The stork stands for something which has its divine orientation from above, from which it cannot deviate, like the wild geese who carry the same projection in Eastern mythology. The pattern of behavior of this bird gives one the impression that it is obeying a secret order, having a divine knowledge. Storks live in North Africa in the winter. There are two types. One flies over Spain and the other over Yugoslavia. They fly as far as possible over land. Experiments have been made and eggs have taken and hatched of the Spanish group. Such a bird, sent off alone at the proper time, will instinctively take the Spanish route, and the bird hatched from the Yugoslav type will take that route. They will fly the right route, according to their pattern, even without companions, for they are guided by the urge from within. Such observations have given rise to the idea that they are pious birds that obey their own laws without ego judgment, and they therefore stand for functioning in accordance with the inner truth and inner being. For this, and since it was believed to hate and kill snakes, the stork was taken as a symbol of Christ, as the transcendent function, the manifestation of the unconscious, which tends to bring up the reconciling symbol, the divine child. In our story, it functions by bringing a renewed form of dominant consciousness, the new king. Rather against the average habit, the tailor does not become the king, but stays at the court, and the shoemaker is cruelly punished. He is driven out into the woods, where the crows pick out his eyes, and then he gets lost. In most fairy tales, the evildoers are cruelly destroyed, a fact which has lately caused much discussion because people thought that to hear that was not good for children. Looking at it from a Jungian standpoint, we must point out that the evildoers who are punished are not real human beings. The children know that instinctively. They are archetypal figures which in a purely destructive way destroy our humanity, and against these forces absolute cruel harshness is needed. We cannot compromise with our alcoholism, drug addiction, or other life-threatening tendencies. We have to stop them absolutely. That is why that is what is expressed in the cruel punishment of mythical evildoers, and why we are satisfied when we hear it. The treatment of the human criminal is another story, which I do not want to discuss here.